In coming up with this presentation, which we feel has an extremely clever title, I'm the UFO researcher. Mathew Moniz is a scientist. Mathew and I have been friends and good friends for about 30 years, and more than 30 years.
More.
But I thought every week, with rare exceptions, when it's recorded, I do a live 2-hour broadcast. It's an actual radio show. It's a lot of mistakes because it's live, but I like that. It's called Meanwhile Here on Earth. And it's on a radio station in the Midwest called KUNX Digital Broadcasting. You can find it on YouTube. And the formats are either panel discussions or one-to-one conversation interviews with people I feel I want to interview. And the imperative for me has been driven by something from childhood, which was a curiosity about how the world of well-known people, that portion of the adult world, whatever their distinctive area, how did they become the people they are in their professional world? And I often ask non-standard questions, and rather than, tell us about your latest book or where we can see you next, I often begin, where were you born? Tell us about your childhood and family. What challenges did you have to overcome? Where did you have the benefit and assistance of an inspired adult to help you find your way? And so on. And being that we are working kind of different sides of the same fence in a way, and that we've got the rapport we do, I thought, who better than Mathew? And so I'm going to begin at the beginning here. Mathew Moniz is a scientist who has, for the last 30 years, has worked in the fields of analytical chemistry, molecular biology, and genetic engineering in labs in the greater Boston and Cambridge area. He has worked on analyzing samples from many famous UFO, crop circle, and paranormal cases over the last couple of decades, and has been the co-host and science advisor for the great radio show Spooky South Coast for the past 17 years. He's also one of the oddballs from the live TV show 30 Odd Minutes, as well as co-host of Inner Space TV with Tom Reed. Featured in many TV shows about UFOs, ghosts, and other unexplained things, he has been a guest on Inside Edition and Ghost Adventures, among others. Moniz has been featured in dozens of books dealing with the unexplained by authors such as Bud Hopkins, Peter Robbins, Tim Weisberg, Jeff Belanger, among others. For the past 20 years, he has worked as the sound engineer and run the AV for many conferences, and now is the official AV engineer for all UFO events for the city of Roswell, New Mexico, and the Roswell Convention Center. May we have a big welcome for my friend and colleague, Mathew Moniz.
Thank you, folks. It's an honor to be here and not have to run the AV system this year.
So, in the spirit of beginning at the beginning, Mathew, where were you born?
I was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, May 9th, 1967. Yeah, I'm old.
Can you tell us a little bit about your folks?
Well, my mother was the youngest of 13 kids from South Boston and Charleston, Irish and Native American descent. My father was an only child, full 100% Portuguese from the Azores. So it was an interesting, fiery mix.
What did your folks do? Was your mom a stay-at-home mom, or did she have a job?
My mom was traditionally trained. She went to a, South Boston High School, Charleston High School, and then went into a a particular school specific for, back then, for women to do secretarial work. So she graduated like a under college for, secretarial. And my father was a truck driver at first when they first met, but then he wound up working for a defense contractor, and basically he was the logistics guy handling shipping and receiving for a company that dealt with Navy equipment. So as a young kid, once my mother was confident that she could leave me and my sister alone without us killing each other. My sister's 3 years my junior, and which is her right there. I got my hands on her and my two cousins on either side. She's like, well, I'm going to go back into the world of work. So she went and spent many years in a type of nursing at Leahy Clinic and stuff like that. And then later on in high school, she went to work for local courthouse in the clerk's office, basically the person typing up the court reports and, okay, here's how you fill out a restraining order. Here's the paperwork to go sue whoever, picking up the phone, answering, and whatever. My father wound up working eventually later on for the office of the governor and the racing commission.
Did you grow up in New Bedford proper or outside?
Outside of New Bedford on the Cape, a little town called Wareham.
Oh.
Hometown to Gina Davis. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I remember as a kid, she was my friend's babysitter. I remember chasing her around the kitchen with frogs and snakes that we would pick up. Now she's like this award-winning actress.
We all have different takes on history. For some of us, it's presented in a manner by our teachers as it's dead stuff that happened in a book. And, for others of us, history is a living thing. We were either inspired by an adult that we know, a teacher, or it's just the way we see the world. I grew up in New York City in a little village about 30 miles east of there. But as a New Yorker, even elementary school, getting your basic education, that first wave of idealized American history, I appreciated that there were some cool, interesting things around the Revolution that happened in New York. But Massachusetts and New England in general, but Massachusetts in specific, was an area that became romanticized for me as, the center of the change and overthrowing the British government. I'm wondering, Matt, as a kid, at what point you began to realize there was this thing called history, and that you were surrounded by it?
Where I grew up in Wareham only got its name in the early 1700s, like 1729, but it was part of another place that the rest of you may know as Plymouth Plantations. Plymouth in the 1600s spanned a very large area. And part of the town I grew up in was at one time Plymouth. And it's the next town over from where I am now. So I was steeped in the history from the very beginning growing up. In particular, where I was a key point for the Revolutionary War in terms of shipping, because the town had a very good sheltered port, and all of the material would come down from Boston, which would be raided by the British. So they would ship the stuff to Wareham, where we had our little port, and that fed a lot of the materials to the rest of New England for the war effort. And finally, the British realized what was happening, and they sent a bunch of Hessians there, and there was lots of issues, and we ran them out of town, hung a couple in the town square and stuff like that. But
about how old were you when this became a real part of your thinking, your mind, your personal history, family history? Up until a certain point, it's still kind of in the dreamy realm and childlike presentation. But there's that point when you realize, and maybe it's a bit different for little boys than girls, but there were men killing each other over this philosophical point of freedom and colonialism, and it happened right there.
Well, what most people don't realize is the largest per capita of its time wholesale slaughter was called the King Philip's War, which is in my backyard, quite literally. Raise your hand if you ever heard of the King Philip's War. Okay, so it was roughly 60% of the English settlers and 78% of the natives were killed in this 2-year massacre. Okay? And this is blood-soaked ground. Okay? So a lot of hunting happenings in my area. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Bridgewater Triangle. Yeah. Again, my backyard.
My elementary school education, this is 1950s, the Pilgrims came over.
Yep.
They met with the Indians. The Indians helped them through their first year. They had Thanksgiving, and somehow, jump ahead, we have the United States of America. Didn't mention that touchy thing about
King Philip
exterminating their asses completely, as much as possible. That sense of, has nothing to do with the paranormal, but there were these people here.
Yes.
Was that something you really appreciated as a kid? Because I didn't.
Being part Native American, yeah, I appreciated it. I could see from both sides, because my mother's family were the part Native were Micmac or Mi'kmaq, depending upon how you want that, you know, which were up in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, out of an area called Burke Church. Now, on my mother's side, both her mother and her father, both their lineage came from there and married into Irish settlers. But the native part of my family that were up there in Burton Church were given an ultimatum because they found oil, you know, on the property. It's either get the hell out or, you know. Some of my mother's family decided to try and stay and fight. They didn't make it. The rest of them were put on a boat to Boston.
Matt, how old are you in this photo?
Given, I would say about 5.
Okay. Do you remember that point in your childhood where you understood that when you grow up, well, we're working on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an abstract.
How long have you known me?
Moving along, but when you become what we laughingly call an adult, you do something to get this stuff called money to do what adults do.
Yeah, I discovered you could buy things with it.
For me, and for so many kids of my generation, soldier, fireman, police officer, did you know early on that there was something about this thing called science that was calling to you?
Yes.
What was it?
It was, for me, the world is a wonder, and I want to know. I've always had this burning sensation of, I want to know. How does it work? Why does it work? Why does it not work in a lot of cases? So trying to figure it out, I would read books. And a lot of times I would be reading books well ahead of where my my regular kids of my age would be reading. And it would cause problems with my teachers because I was reading well ahead of where I should be. And they kept telling me, no, no, no. And it caused me great concern because it's like, why not? I understand it. Well, you shouldn't be doing that now.
Get with the program.
Why?
Yeah.
I want to read about it. So, yeah.
In elementary school, junior high school, obviously you had mastered reading. Were you reading books about various areas of science for pleasure or more, this is my focus? What was you reading for pure enjoyment?
A little A and a little B. You know, one of my favorite authors, Isaac Asimov, who wrote both. If you understand what I mean. He wrote both fiction and science books.
Yep.
So I enjoyed Asimov, and I also had a great desire to understand esoteric things. And I would read, books by, how many of you know Joseph Campbell? Okay, I was reading him at 8 years old.
Following your bliss from that point on, hopefully.
Yeah.
Going to the next picture.
Yep. My mother, my sister, my grandmother, and me way up in the back.
Same thing for the world of movies. For some of us, our introduction to films was on television. For others, our family would go out to the theater sometimes, or you go out with your friends. How did you come to watch and enter the world of film?
Well, interestingly enough, I have a cousin that actually works in Hollywood, and she would come home from Hollywood and talk about the movies that she worked on. I'm 10 years old when Star Wars came out. My cousin Sherry goes, "Oh yeah, I filmed in that." And I'm like, "You were in Star Wars?" "Yeah, in this scene, you'll see me wearing this." And it was like, 10, 11 years old, all of a sudden I'm starstruck, but it's my cousin.
Whether or not we're hardcore science fiction fans, for most of us, we certainly read some science fiction in our lifetimes. If we're lucky, it's really good and inspiring. But as we know, especially in a forum and a hall like this, there are places where that line between science fiction, science, and the deeply paranormal, there's no discerning. At a certain point in your life, did you come to realize you were having experiences that were, to put it mildly, non-standard and that other children weren't? And how did you begin to deal with this?
My very first memory, and I didn't deal with it well. Does that answer that question?
Yes. Can you tell us a bit about what it was that experience was?
Okay. I'm going to share it with you. I've shared it on air a number of times. Roughly 1970, my sister had just been born, living right next to the Cape Cod Canal in a town called Sagamore, right outside of the gates of Otis Air Force Base. My very first recollection is being, like I said, 3 years old. Typical kid, not wanting to go to bed. I'm in bed, but, my parents are sleeping in another room. So I got my little toy matchbox cars or, whatever, little toy cars. And I'm sitting in my bed. I got my knees up with the covers, and I'm using my feet as a ramp. So I put the car at the top of the knees, and it'd go down and zip, and then, land on the end, down to bed. I had several of them, so I would see which one could jump the farthest. I'm entertaining myself, being quiet, not trying to wake my parents, because I know if I do, I'm going to be in trouble, because I woke my sister. Ergo. So I'm being quiet, just playing with the cars. And then there's a set of windows to my left in my bedroom. And all of a sudden, this turquoise, greenish, bluish light very, very lightly starts to come into the room. I'm half paying attention because I know there's a street light that's out in the back parking lot where our apartment was. And, so I figured the light came on and whatever. Okay, big deal. And then all of a sudden, the light started to get brighter and pulsate. That got my attention because that's not normal from what I remember as a kid when the light came on for the parking lot. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. I gathered up my little cars and I get ready to do my next round of let's see who can jump the farthest. And all of a sudden that light really started to flicker and strobe, at which point I realized, not right. This is something really, really, really not right. And I got an overwhelming sense of fear and dread. So I did what any normal 3-year-old kid would do in this case. Exactly. Tuck the covers over my head and hid, because that would make me safe. Yeah, it didn't work out that way. Because the next thing I knew, the ambient barometric pressure in the room changed. And when I mean changed, I mean it felt like a vacuum sucking in the room, and the light really started to strobe. And when I mean there was a definite vacuum sense in the room, it was so much that my closet door popped and creaked open like you hear in a horror movie, which really sent me over the edge, because, you know, this is not right. This is not right. Then all of a sudden, you know, through the sheet, if you have a bright light, you can see shadows move around. You know, I saw this shadow starting to move in the room, and then it started coming over towards the bed. The moment it jumped up onto the bed, I'm holding my sheets with a death grip. My entire body locked out to the point where every fiber of my fingers and toes and legs stretched to the point it hurt. And I mean, hurt. I was immobilized, involuntarily. Now, some people, oh, sleep paralysis. I was fully awake. Okay? You know, that's the other thing. With abductions, people that are being abducted are awake, then get paralyzed, then go unconscious. Right. People who sleep paralysis are unconscious, wake up, and are paralyzed, not the other way around. But anyway, as this thing got up onto the bed, it was walking with one foot on either side of my body. And I'm trying to, you know, do whatever I could to try and wake my parents at this point. I wanted to scream, and the only thing I could move was my eyes. So I inhaled as best I could, and all I got out was, at that level, once. I couldn't scream. And I'm still locked out with the only thing able to move is my eyes. And I see the shadow slowly walking up over my bed. Then the next thing is a hand on my face. And it starts doing this, searching for the edge of the covers. Finally found it, peeled the covers off, and I'm nose to nose, this far away from something. The word I used for it was ancient. It looked ancient by definition. A lot of these things that you're seeing, you know, with these, you know, the green aliens and grays, they portray them as smooth skin, very, you know, no. Have any of you ever seen an elephant up close? Okay. If you've ever seen their skin, it's very wrinkled and mottled and filled with cracks and furrows. That's what this thing looked like, and that's why I thought it was very ancient. Now, people saying, oh, it's gray like an elephant. No. Raise your hand if you've ever seen a rainbow trout in person. So you know how their skin changes with iridescence, with the angle that you change the lights with. It had the same kind of thing in that skin. It was wrinkled and mottled, but it had pinks and black dots and grays and greens, depending upon which way it moved in the ambient light. I could see why people would call it gray. From at a distance, it would look grayish, but up close, it's a bunch of different colors depending upon the angle at which you're looking at it from. The other thing was the eyes. The eyes that they have, are fairly accurate in so much that they're almondish shape. The thing that really got me was the nose. Now, the nose had nostrils that were out to the side that would open and close each time it breathed. Now, it reminded me when it was breathing, inhaling, it had similar to a cat's triangular shaped nose, but it kept having these flaps that would close like a seal does when it dives underwater. Like I said, I had up-close personal view of this thing. This is my very first conscious memory as a child because it made that much of an impression on me. And its mouth, although thin and narrow, would articulate. I don't remember it opening the mouth or seeing any teeth or anything, but this thing was doing this in my face, and I'm freaked out, you know, as any normal 3-year-old would be, or adult for that matter.
Anybody.
But, you know, that was the last thing I remembered. And then I'm waking up the following morning.
That is just where I want to pick up on the next question. Even a 3-year-old can make certain judgment calls that touch on logic in the adult world. Was your first impulse to try to share what happened with your parents, or?
Yeah.
Okay, how did that go?
No more pepperoni pizza for you before you go to bed.
And hence the alien problem is solved.
Yeah.
Do you remember how you felt about that?
Angry.
Yeah.
Very, very angry.
It's an indirect way of saying.
Yeah. It's like, I just told you I encountered something last night that scared the crap out of me, and you're just blowing me off. There's something that was in my room. Aren't you supposed to protect me?
I'm going to insert here that part of my background, some of you know the name in the world of UFO studies of Bud Hopkins. Bud's been gone dozen years or so now. And he was one of my best friends. He was a major mentor in my life. And for about half of our 35-year friendship, I was his assistant and privy to several hundred abduction-related investigations, some in the course of an afternoon, one running for 6 full years. And I became involved in the field of UFO studies, not because of intellectual curiosity or that I had that kind of experience, but because I had a profoundly unambiguous sighting, along with one of my sisters, when we were kids growing up on Long Island, of 5 silvery white disc-shaped UFOs in a very precise formation. It was so overwhelming for me. At 14, I probably had sophistication approaching Jerry Mathers and Leave It to Beaver. It was a very innocent time, and I was an innocent kid, growing up in a relatively, really happy childhood without a lot of complications. And suddenly, I'm confronting something that I already intuited was not real because that was the message from the adult community. Of course, flying saucers are real in the movies you see on Saturday afternoon at the movie theater, but otherwise. And I went through something that I've documented in many witnesses, more than I remember over the decades, that I came to call the checklist reaction. You're minding your business, you're living your life, you're going about what you're doing, and all of a sudden, things change. There's something there. And my rational mind, and I've relived this several times in hypnotic regression, after more than 14 years of that memory being deeply repressed, of not a plane, they're not kites, blimps, balloons, helicopters, dirigibles, strange-shaped clouds, formation of birds. I don't even know if they had large plastic garbage bags back then, but I hit the wall. And in my regression, the first one, there is a very poignant moment for me hearing myself literally being 14 again. People experience hypnosis in different ways. Some people at a safe distance, other people, you're there, you're it. You're feeling the feelings, you're smelling the smells. And my last attempt at trying to hold on to the reality I understood was, the words were, quote unquote, they must be some kind of secret government test plane. Yeah, that's what it is. They're secret government test planes. And then you catch yourself, I caught myself, no, planes have wings. They have tails, they have fronts, they have backs, they have propellers. They're not round. And I would say at that moment I experienced kind of the deep, a cosmic loneliness. I knew in that moment that everything I had come to think I knew at that moment in my life was now open to questioning. And I couldn't have that. And so within 2 weeks, who knows how we do these things? And it happens, sadly, much more often in conventional trauma than unconventional trauma. I made myself forget. And 14 years later, and a little bit, I'm in the grown-up world. I am living the beginning of what I thought would be my lifelong dream. I was a graduate of the School of Visual Arts in New York. I was now a faculty member there. My aspiration was to be a successful, well-known, internationally recognized painter and sculptor with a big studio in New York. And I was on the way. And that afternoon, when the memory came roaring back, I kind of broke down for a while. I knew I must be going crazy because I know no rational person can forget a memory like that, except that we can. And I was able to compose myself enough, have a cup of tea, call my sister, and not blurt out my memory, but say, I've remembered something that happened to us when we were kids, and I need to know what you remember. So let me set the scene. And time of day, time of year, where we were standing, and she cut me off mid-sentence and said, stop, I know what you're talking about, and proceeded to tell me what I remembered, with one detail in contention that we worked out the next day when she came over, and as soon as we got off the phone, I did a painting of what we had seen with an extra one added, so that when she came into my studio and we walked over, I held my hand over the right lower one, and then I removed it. And she said, you're right, it was 5 because I remember it was even. And I had a moment where, kind of a split moment, oh my God, it was real. Oh my God, it was real. Now that wasn't what transformed my life, and transformed usually has a pleasant fairy tale kind of sense to it. It wasn't what derailed my career and obsessed me with this subject until I managed to tame the obsession after several years, and then found myself doing this stuff professionally, which was my sister, almost 50 years ago, saying to me, but there's more. And I don't know how you're going to feel about it in so many words. And then proceeding to tell me what we would now describe as hyper-articulate, absolute, classic fragments of memory that UFO abductees have, sometimes word for word. And I'm listening to this, and for several seconds, my reaction was, Helen's gone insane. And then catching myself saying, oh, but 8 seconds ago, it was fine for 5 flying saucers to be hanging over the Parker's house, close enough to make out windows. And my art career, I faked it for years. I continued to teach, I continued to show my work, but that driving passion that you need to be a world player in that ferociously inbred field was gone. It's never really come back, and I still resent it in a way. However, I traded one interesting dream of a life for another real interesting life. And I wanted to insert that here because when you do this work, whether you're the researcher or the experiencer, the abductee or the author, if you're open to your own or other people's experiences, a byproduct is you become more patient, you become more empathetic, you become more caring of people you don't know, because you always remember the strangers are carrying around great weights, and we're all like each other, except that we're in different shells, different ages, different sexes. So I want to get back to Matt here. From that point on, this was something you didn't have the experience I did. You continue to remember this for the rest of your life.
Yes. I mean, it caused a problem for me where I was living because I was severely traumatized. I was fearing that they would come back, they would come back, they would come back. And the Head Start type of school basically is a form of daycare. It was on the Otis Air Force Base. My parents would drop me off there. And I would be so worried about these things coming back, and I would build things. It's like, all right, they're going to come back. I'm going to hide myself in these boxes and whatever. So I would grab these. Basically, they were old ammo crates from, the military. And what they did is they put AstroTurf in a Quonset hut with a picket fence around, and the kids would play inside this AstroTurfed area with the picket fence and the painted ammo boxes. Instead of being the OD green or the gray, they painted them happy yellow, and but they worked with what they had. So I was making this thing inside this little play area, and one of the kids grabbed one of the boxes, and I wanted it back because I was so panicked that, I grabbed the box and I whacked him with it, and that caused a problem because, why are you doing that? And I tried to explain it, and, they had no idea what I was talking about. And, so my family was like, well, enough of this. We're going to go move to Wareham instead of, where we were. But it was still such a trauma that, I lashed out because I thought I was going to be in peril again, not realizing that no matter what I did, things are going to happen. So,
Matt, a dual question. Was this initial incident at 3 years old followed by other similar or varying types of non-standard?
Same kind of experience. I knew that, first, after the first one, I knew what that feeling was when it was going to happen again. And from roughly 3 to age 5, it would happen reoccurringly. And that's why I was getting panicked. After, for whatever reason, age 5, things started to, I got to the point where I just, screw it, I don't care, I'm not going to let this run or ruin my life.
That said, did you ever reattempt to approach your parents with this, or
no?
Did you ever talk to any of your friends, or you just knew this was something probably better served?
Yeah, I kept my mouth shut.
Okay. How did this filter into, I know my sister, one of her memories was being on the table.
Yep.
And being 12 years old. And one of the parts of the profile of people who go through these experiences that is completely counterintuitive or logical is often while these events are happening, your attitude is not what Matt's was, which in a way is healthier. It's a real reaction to a real situation. But isn't this interesting? Or, gosh, look at these interesting people, and countless profiles where you shake your head and say, you should be screaming bloody murder. And one of the first things Helen told me was after I was knocked out, I went unconscious for the first time in my life, she simply rose off the ground and started to rise in the air. And again, more than 14 years later, we're talking about this, and she said, I knew after a few seconds, whatever was going on, if it stopped, I would fall and die. I'm looking down at you getting smaller. I'm looking down at the roof of our house for the first and only time in my life. And my attitude is, isn't this interesting? And my hair is long and blowing. And oh, look, the bottoms of these things are getting bigger. She's on the table. Her attitude still continues. And again, this is part of the profile that makes no sense. They have the power to do these things. Of just 12 years old, no clothes on, lying there, a bunch of what we would call archetypical little grays and one particularly tall one, and the telepathic communication, always in the language of the individual, and sometimes word for word. We love you, you're special, you've seen us before, we'll see you again, we will not harm you, we love you. Unfortunately for them, in terms of any future warmth in terms of the relationship with my sister, at a moment where she was hearing, we love you, we will not harm you, she was experiencing pain in her genital area for whatever was going on. she channeled her anger at the Greys in a remarkably creative way. She went on to become a gold and platinum record award-winning singer-songwriter and performer. And part of her whole act was, it was punk and it was filled with anger. And that anger was informed by a lot of those childhood memories. I mean, you immediately get the sense here that Matt walks through life like a Buddhist monk and has never any anger to deal with. That's a joke, folks. But as time went on, you're living an overtly split life.
Right.
There's one thing, series of events happening on one side of the screen of your life and on the other, but you're not allowing any bleed through. You're keeping a straight face to the world. Did there come a particular event or events that exacerbated or changed or in some way reset the...
Yes, at 11 years old, one of these particular times or whatever you want to call this event, I would be doing a number of different things, you know, trying to flail out, trying to, you know, whatever I could do to obfuscate or whatever they're doing. So I remember one particular circumstance, I was like, let me try this. I'm 11 years old. And I remember projecting or actually saying out loud, I don't believe in you. You're not real. And I got this quizzical look from one of these things that was beside me. And this is one of the few times I've actually received information. And the quizzical response was, it doesn't matter if you believe that we're real. What matters is we believe you're real. At 11 years old, I'm going, wow, okay, now what the fuck? How do you, you know, 11 years old doesn't think outside the box like that if it's imagination, you know, because it seriously, and I got the impression, it doesn't matter. What matters is what we believe. And I couldn't argue it. That's when that was at the point where I finally surrendered to the, all right, this is going to be happening. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm just going to let it happen. And if they make a mistake, I'm going to fuck them up. And that's how my progressions had gone since.
In the world of UFO abduction studies, it's just one more area of study in an area of interest. You could think of 100 other examples, whether it's in biology or the history of electronics or technological development, where, for example, in the world of UFO studies, declassified documents, people who look into physiological changes in organic and inorganic material that has been exposed to a paranormal situation or UFO, regressions, family histories, implants, historical events involving sightings or, you know, in ship's logs or in the records of monasteries. And in the world of UFO abduction studies, certain patterns have started to emerge over the last few decades that it's first observed in an individual case, and because you haven't been looking for it, you never even thought of asking the question of other individuals. And in these cases, you start to, and you see, my gosh, that happened here too, and you start to be able to connect lines. Something happened to Matthew that he shared with me many years later that caused me, basically, on our first visit, to tell Bud Hopkins about it. And Matt and Bud met. They actually became very close. And because Matt had the courage to talk about it, we started looking into other cases and backtracking and saw the same damn thing, which we now see regularly, that's as illogical and strange and otherworldly as any part of this. There came a time, Matt, when, as a boy, you found yourself in a neutral space, as I recall,
Yep.
just indirectly lit, with a little girl. Can you tell us about that memory?
Okay, I was 16 years old. They picked me up. They put me in a special type of suit. They walked me into this room that basically is, it was ovalish, and it had gray boxes that started with a path in the center that went up to the edge of the roof, kind of like an amphitheater or a stadium type of setting. The room was probably no bigger than this room, maybe a little bit bigger. And I got pushed into the room because, like I said, I don't play well with them. And I'm like, okay, now what? And I'm walking up and down these boxes trying to find a way out, find what's going on. And I get back down to the little pathway in between, and a doorway on the other side opens up. These two little guys walk in with a girl about my age, dressed in the same kind of black, uniform, for lack of a better term. And she comes walking over to me. We start a conversation like, what's going on? Do you understand? Da, 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 da. And then we start being teenagers. We start talking about school, our parents, our favorite bands, like typical kids do. She was pretty attractive, and these suits had very particular type of interesting property, and we kept playing with each other's suits and this and that. So this conversation went on for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and we started walking around and trying to find ways out, and came back to where we originally sat and continued on with our conversation. And then the door opened to the other side where she came out, and they basically motioned to her, like, come with us. And me being 16 years old, trying to be Mr. Bravado, I pushed her behind me and took a defensive stance, like, you can't have her, you're gonna have to go through me. And again, one of the few times—
Easy enough.
That's a story for another day. But basically, I was trying to be Mr. Tough Guy, and they're like, if you let her come with us, we'll take you home. At which point, here you go. See you later. So she walks with them, and the two that are standing at the doorway, she's walking through. I made a quick little bluff charge, and they turned around and ran through the door and shut the door quickly. Well, fast forward about 6, 7 years, I'm in my early 20s, and it was April Fool's at Bristol Community College in an it was a planetarium. Again, the stadium-type seating with a domed roof, especially lit. Stanton Friedman was giving a lecture. And I'm sitting there, my friend Maurice. So he's sitting next to me, and we're sitting there. I'm in the front row listening to Stanton Friedman. And the door on the other end of the planetarium opens up. In walks this girl. Her. I immediately stand up, walk right past Stanton Friedman. While he's talking, he's doing, and he goes back, because I was beeline, all I could see was her. And it's like, I know it was her. And I continue on walking. I start walking up the steps. She's got her coat and her purse and whatever, and she looks up and sees me and does one of these, drops everything. And we go sit immediately at a seat. Hey, how you doing? How's it? We exchanged names, first off, and then we just were attached to each other for, the whole night there. And then we wound up having a meetup later on, a couple of weeks later, sat down, had coffee, had dinner. A couple of weeks after that, started continuously dating. 2 or 3 months later, we're living together. 5 years later, we got married. and then wound up divorced. But in that time, yeah, purely human reasons. But what wound up happening is we got introduced. Got introduced to Bud, and Bud was really fascinated by our story. And then he started realizing there were a ton of these other cases, and he used, my ex's name is Lisa, and he used Lisa and I to help vet out some of these other cases because we understood what was going on because we've been through it.
I want you to realize that what Mathew has just said seems so outside of anything you've ever heard directly from any person that sometimes our reaction is just inappropriate. You know, we've got a guffaw or just, it can't be, therefore it isn't. Now I'm losing this guy a little because this couldn't possibly happen to anyone. It's an act of extraordinary courage in sharing this in a public forum. As far as I know, it's never been done before. One of the upshots of learning this was in 1989, Bud received a letter from a woman in Manhattan. Part of my job was to open mail and read it, mark what should go to his attention immediately and the like, and this was one that should. It went on to become a case that obsessed me as well as Bud, still does. We worked it for 6 years. The result was a book was published in 1996 called Witnessed, the true story of the Brooklyn Bridge UFO abductions. We saw the same pattern once Bud really looked with Linda and one of the security officers for the internationally known political figure who got caught up in this as another victim. Matt, do you think that your commitment to science, one of the ultra-rationalistic pursuits, was partly informed by, as a way to reacting to these things you couldn't control and this part of your life that wasn't scientific, easily wrapped around? Do you think it had anything to do with your career direction?
Interesting, because I always wanted to become a scientist, and the way I got into it was at the time my father had a delivery business, so one of the laboratories I worked for delivering stuff back and forth, I would go into the various labs to pick up their samples and, or whatever, and I was always wanted to be a scientist, so I was very curious. What are you doing here with this? Well, how are you testing that? How does this work? How does that work? And this went on for a couple of years. And then all of a sudden, I was asking one of the directors of the particular lab that I was picking samples up for, what is this going for? Oh, we're sending this stuff down to Woods Hole Oceanographic. They're going to do this. You're going to pick up samples, come back. We're going to look for that. I wish I could do that. I always wanted to do that. And they're like, well, we have a lab tech position open up. Do you want, but yeah, right now, where do I sign? What do I got to do? Well, you're just going to be washing beakers. Oh, okay. So without any formal education, I got hired in as a basic lab tech washing glassware. And, what do you want to show me? So I would poke all the PhDs. What are you doing? Show me how it works. How does it, and I would learn. I went from washing beakers to operating high-tech pieces of equipment in under a year. Second year, I was taking the pieces of equipment apart and putting them back together. Mainly because in high school, I had 4 years of automotive. When these pieces of equipment would break, they would have to call the vendor or the manufacturer to come down and repair it for very expensive money. And I'm like, give me the damn manual. Okay, if I can rebuild a Chevy 350, I think I can handle this. As long as you can order me the parts. Okay, so that's what I did. I started repairing what are called HPLCs, or high performance liquid chromatography, and mass specs, mass spectrometers, things that would measure atoms down to single atom or Dalton. And then I started learning how to operate them. Then I started developing methods with them. And any PhD in any lab I was in, I would have them teach me. I was also going to school at night at, Bristol Community College, UMass, Dartmouth, and a little cow college in Cambridge called Harvard. But I would go to the manufacturers' classes of how to repair them. So that's what made me valuable. I could not only operate the equipment, I could fix it too. So
something is happening here that I knew was going to happen. I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen, which is we are burning through the time that we have and have left. So Matt and I are now going to do the best we can to exercise what little critical discipline we have to roar through the rest of our images and the accounts attached.
Okay, me and my sister. Yeah, the very first lab I was working, like I told you. Not much has changed other than my shoes.
Well,
and the beard.
Yeah, I was going to say, scientifically speaking. Now, jump back to me. It's 1983. I'm looking for a serious case to work. An event from 1980 breaks in public, a UFO incident in England. I'm hooked. And a few years later, I meet somebody who alleges that they were an eyewitness to this while in the Air Force. I agree to work on a book with them. We go back to England. A very friendly picture that gives you an idea of what I was in for. I thought this would be my only trip for the book. Next week, I go back to England for the 25th time, I think. That's where it happened. RAF Bentwaters, an American NATO base. And if you relax your eyes a bit, right about there. The discoloration is, where is it?
It's right to the, yeah.
It's hard to see in this image.
Yeah.
But my colleague and I walked out into the field, and he pointed and said, that's where it's at. In 1980. And I walked out, and I had shooting 35 millimeter film. Remember, some of you are old enough, the little plastic containers they came in. Love those things. I had a few of them, hadn't anticipated what was about to happen, and the little sticky labels from the microcassettes I was using, and I very quickly drew 3 soil samples. I knew enough to go to the center of the mass, to the edge, and then about 100 feet out into the field for control sample. Went back to the B&B, we dumped them out on paper. They looked different, they felt different. I felt I was onto something. Get back to the States, find a laboratory that analyzes organic material. Wareham Environmental Laboratory in, Springborn in Wareham, Massachusetts. And I tell them what I'm interested in, and the nice gal on the phone says, how much soil do you have? And I proudly told her 3 film canisters full. And she said as kindly as she could, sir, you haven't done this before, have you? We're going to need about 15 pounds of dirt. I go back to England after contacting Wareham. They're kind enough to send me large industrial plastic containers. I fill them in the same areas, go back, flying into JFK, think, I don't want to have to go through this with security. I'll just sneak them in, no big deal. Wouldn't have been a problem. But then I start to think, if we ever get this book completed and it's published and we have results here, some wag can say, excuse me, you brought soil into the United States? Don't you know on your entry card it doesn't just say sausages and fruit? It says soil. In the old days, I thought, fuck this. And I declare it, and I am taken to a little room, compress here. The gentleman I'm working with, what is this? It's dirt. What's it for? Analysis. What does this have to do with? A book I'm working on. What's the book? It's a book with another guy about something that happened. I realize it's just going nowhere. And finally, he alleges that he was involved in a UFO incident. Supposedly, he says, I see, wait here, walks out, me and the dirt are locked in my room. He returns with 3 colleagues. What's the laboratory you're going to be using for analyzing the dirt? Soil. Where environmental, more than where, takes down a loose leaf book. I don't know if it's in the book. Yep, they're accredited. So what's you're gonna ship this right out? You're not planning to open this, are you? And I immediately saw in his eyes the Martian germs escaping into JFK and poisoning the world. No, all be tape sent, which I did. And this is the technician who volunteered to do the analysis. This gives you a better idea. You see the discoloration is now
green.
The grass that's green, everything else has gone. We won't go into all the results. However, even in this simple photo, you can see there's a difference. You could feel it. With the control sample from the field, mix it with a certain amount of water, it becomes mud. The other sample that floats on the water like dust.
It's called hydrophobic, meaning it doesn't allow water to mix with it.
Laboratory, Bud. And brings us to Bud, who also is very privy to this case. I'm not going to go into the whole story of what happened with it, but again, Bud had a wonderful dual career, best known figure in the world in UFO studies for many years, certainly the father of scientific study of the abduction phenomena. That's him and me 30-odd years ago.
I remember when that was taken.
That's 2010, about a year before he died. Great man, great guy, amazing writer, brilliant researcher.
Wonderful artist.
First book, absolute paradigm shifter. Really important reading. Second book, international bestseller. Third book, witnessed other books. But this was his last book. And it says what it says. 2008, published 3 years before he died. It's a wonderful American memoir. The complaints were from people in the UFO world, too much about art and life. From people in the art world, too much about UFO, etc. Worth reading.
Oh, good, yeah.
Matt, with one of the leading figures in international respected journalists, Leslie Kane.
There's the soil. And the film canisters down below. What she's looking at, I have pieces of Betty Hill's dress that I did analysis on too for. I'll shut up.
Saw that?
Yeah.
So,
doing crop circle research with Colin Andrews.
We meet Colin Andrews. I met him in 1991.
Yeah.
And you met him really about the same time.
Yeah.
And Colin and Matt started to work together. Colin being the man who created the term crop circle, the man whose life literally was destroyed by his obsession, published his first book with his co-author, and that summer it goes on the Queen's reading list, and he's having tea with Her Majesty at Buckingham Palace. The destinies and the directions that this work leads people in are unpredictable. Colin and I, back in the day,
experiences speak.
This is a conference that only ran for 2 years, unfortunately. It was called...
5.
5? Yeah. Really? It was called Experiencers Speak, and it took place every year in Portland, Maine. 2 remarkable sisters and their families back him put this conference together. It turned the tables. People like myself or Stanton Friedman, Kathleen...
Raise your hands if you heard of the Starborn twins. UFO Starborn twins.
Got one back there.
Now, do we want to get into this connection?
We've got the luxury of several minutes. Go for it.
All right. Now, I told you how I met my ex-wife, right? While my ex and I were together, we were continuously being taken. I was, I met a number, I was put into rooms with plenty of other people. On one particular occasion, there were a pair of twins. and I was talking to them as we were being moved from one place to another. We were put on, best way to describe it is a subway car or tram going from one part to another wherever we were at, and we were having a conversation. They go off in one direction after the thing stopped, and I got escorted down another direction. Fast forward another 5 years, 5, 6 years, after my ex and I had split up. It was the following year, actually. Working at a biker bar run by the Hells Angels. And I'm the sound engineer. You know, so I would come in Friday, Saturday night, and the band would come in, and I'd set up all the microphones, and I'd be behind the board. For me, it was therapy, you know, after working and, you know, trying to decompress. They paid me well. They took care of me as far as food and, you know, whatever happened in the back rooms and whatever. I don't know, I don't care, la, 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 la. You get the point. But, you know, I was there for the band and to get paid. If something went wrong, hey, Tiny. Tiny was about 7 foot. But anyway, you get the point. So I'm sitting there, I'm working the board. All of a sudden, this girl comes out from the side where the bar was. I looked at her, and it's one of the twins. She turns around, sees me, comes immediately and sits on my lap and puts a big bear hug around me. So good to see you again. And I'm like, the famous Yogi Berra line, it's deja vu all over again. So, and she motions her twin sister over, and her twin sister is, hey, how you doing? You know, da, 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 da. So I've been in contact with 3 people I've met on board that I've met later on in this stark reality and remember them. Now that takes it completely out of the realms of what I call psychobabble bullshit, because how do I know somebody having never met them, quote unquote? As a scientist, I'm going, I know where I've encountered them, and I know that they are there. I've had this interaction, and they are able to reciprocate what we've seen and said to each other after having met here for the very first time.
I want
Wrap your minds around that one, kids.
To keep in mind that the kinds of experiences Mathew is describing
is not unusual or not rare.
That more people than I am comfortable thinking about per capita have had these experiences happen. If you pressed me after more than 40 years focused on the abduction phenomena, but also a general practitioner in the work, the least I could say to you is, unless you have been living under a rock, are, you know, an emotional basket case shut away at an institution, or a hermit, you know at least one person who is living a life something like this. David Jacobs, Dr. David Jacobs, one of the most noteworthy contributors here, his first book was titled Secret Life. And there are millions of people, even now in this more open time, post-December 2017, New York Times, Ralph Blumenthal, Leslie Kean, Helene Cooper, paradigm-shifting articles in the Times. We're now in a healthier era, but I'll say every year more and more people care less and less about what other people think about what they think about this subject. And I know that pretty well fits some of you who wouldn't be talking about this to your neighbors 10 years ago, or might not be in this room, because somebody might recognize you and we'd all know you're crazy. Support group.
Yeah, from my radio show, Spooky South Coast. 18 years now. We've been on the air 18 years.
2009, there was
a scientist,
paranormal...
a sports writer, and a silent assassin. If you can't believe them, who can you believe?
In 2009, I believe it was, there was a paranormal conference in, was it in Concord? It was in Massachusetts, of course, and you and I had some downtime after.
Watertown.
Okay. Again, going back to the beginning, this thing for me of history being a living thing. And always trying to connect with it wherever I am and experience it. Matt took me to one of the most iconic locations.
Me with pieces of the Roswell weather balloon.
The history of the formation of our nation. This bridge, Lexington Concord, this iconic figure.
Yep.
And then
The Patriot.
set me off down a trail where early on in the conflict, American partisans were laying wait in the woods. And this beautiful, idyllic stretch was where they separated quite a number of British soldiers from their lives 3,000 miles from home.
Yep.
The perks, if that's the word, for being in this unusual field are priceless very often. I've gotten to meet people I would have never met otherwise who have become some of the dearest people in my life, or friendly acquaintances or ultimately good friends. Every once in a while I get to travel, do my radio show and interview people every week. But it keeps coming back to we're all just human, we're all here together. The human race is living this double life. Most of the folks we know, maybe, oh, that's my friend who's into UFOs. It's not that they think it's wrong or silly or bad, it's just that they're doing what most people do, or most good people try to do, which is pay their bills, raise their kids, stay healthy, hope we have Social Security by the time they need it, etc. But never forget, we are in an extraordinary changing world, and this is all real, and it's happening. And this terrific event, for me, is emblematic of it. It's split also. The kids can have a great time out there, as you can, and here, we're educating each other and doing our best to continue to wrap our heads around what's really happening with friends and without. Thank you.